Hi, it's Simon here, and just before we get into the episode, we really need your help with something. We have a survey out that we'd love you to jump on and do. It's all about life and faith, and if you're listening right now, you are the perfect person to do this. The survey won't take long, probably about 5 minutes, and it would help us a lot as we shape life and faith and think about how we can do it better. The survey will be running till mid-November, so if you have a few spare minutes, go to the show notes to click on the link or go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org. Now, for those who do, there will be the opportunity to win what I think is a fabulous prize. So thanks for your help. Now to the episode. This week on Life and Faith.
If your political position has no regard or nothing to say about, or open disregard and contempt for those who have the least, then I don't think it gets to be called Christian.
All these things are suddenly changing.
One of your own countrymen, Nick Cave, is quite an interesting example here.
Ethical foods tend to be a lot more expensive.
My mother had a serious illness.
It might seem as if the entirety of the cosmos was a bit of a put-up job.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
I'm Justine Toe.
Well, we begin today with a confession. You're listening to this episode after the US election, but we pulled it together beforehand. So, as we record this, we are none the wiser as to the outcome. And that's okay, because a big point that our guest today will make is that in certain respects, it doesn't matter who runs the country. Maybe the next occupant of the White House is not the person you want there. Or the Lodge for us in Australia, staring down the barrel of a federal election in 2025. But everyday people still have to get on with things and go about their lives. The question is, Justine, how are we going to do that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was going back through some old episodes of Life and Faith, and I came across your chat, Simon, with Michael Ware in June, right, earlier this year. Now, Michael Ware was faith advisor in Barack Obama's White House, and he now runs the Center for Christianity and Public Life out of Maryland in the US. And you did ask him at one point, Simon, what was going to be the case on the other side of the US election? And this is what he had to say.
I think we need to move from a place of talking and acting as if this is just a matter of our politics acting on us, our politics happening to us, and instead talk about what kind of witness we are going to be with our lives and our families and our churches and our communities. But we need to stop accepting what our politics is giving to us and sort of assuming that's the way it has to go. Well, of course, I would never talk about people in my personal life the way that I do in politics, but that's politics. This is just how the game is done. No, we actually need to say we're playing according to a different set of rules. We're living in a different reality. It's actually not politics that is at the foundation of human interaction. Actually, we could relate to one another in a different way and actually be a correction on our politics.
That's Michael Ware there. I thought it was worth inserting that because I think it's an excellent setup for my interview today with Michael Jensen. Now, Michael, of course, recently interviewed you, Simon, for The End of Men.
He did.
But this time I got to interview Michael. Michael's a theologian and Anglican minister. He's currently based at St Mark's Darling Point in Sydney. And he's also a frequent public commentator in the news media and the co-host with Megan Pal Dutoit of the podcast With All Due Respect, which is about disagreeing constructively across lines of difference. He also happens to be the author of the book Subjects and Citizens, The Politics of the Gospel. And I thought this chat would really be good because he would help us probe the expectations that we bring to politics and the heightened stakes, really, that many of us feel about elections, both here and elsewhere. So to get the chat going, I asked Michael to tell me about the most political thing he's ever done.
I mean, at one level, just voting's the most political thing I've ever done, but I've been an advocate for things, usually for causes, not for parties. So I've spoken about The Voice and about same-sex marriage, for instance, in public. I'm not a great marcher, I have to say, or a protester, But I think being involved in politics and trying to influence, put your opinion across is more than that. I'm in regular touch with my local MPs over things, and I've certainly written to them over various causes. And I think that's a great habit to get into. It's a wonderful thing in our society that you can do that. But my other answer would be that every Sunday I worship Jesus Christ as Lord, and that's really a political statement of a kind.
Yeah, we will get into that. But before we do, let's just lean more into that first half of your question. Because it seems to me that in Australia, in the US and the UK as well, the quest for political power has felt increasingly fraught. And as though that if the other party gets in, they pose some kind of existential threat to us. So if I can get you to put your public commentator hat on for a minute, what's fueling that anxiety?
Oh, there's a number of things, and I think simplistic explanations don't much work. I think one thing is, it's been noted by other commentators, is the tension between global citizenship and local identity, and the feeling that local, national, ethnic identities are being left behind. I think in a sort of globalized economy, I think that's true, and certainly the feeling that some people have of contempt for people who want to uphold their local economies, or the feeling that others hold me in contempt, doesn't fuels the tension.
Childless cat ladies.
I would say. Childless cat ladies, all the rest of it. So there's a bit of, they must hate me, and so I don't like being hated, and all of that sort of stuff. I think that occurred in Brexit in the United Kingdom, and is going on in the United Kingdom at the moment. The feeling that bureaucratic governments out of our control in large capital cities are diluting local identities or opening up our nations to values that are not our locally held values. I think that's a tension, and the feeling that perhaps people should just get over that, that's kind of coming from the other side. So I think that's major. I think also hidden behind this is actually the... now, this is going to sound a bit like a conspiracy theory. Are you okay with this?
Yeah, go for it.
So that is, I do think, what Shoshana Zuboff, the academic, calls surveillance capitalism. That is the rise of the big tech giants. I mean, this is an academic study that she's done of the big tech giants is fueling a lot of this, in the sense that they are weaponizing conflict and profiting massively from division. And so we find ourselves further and further, the extremes are being amplified, and I think that's led to further and further division. So the old, very dull consensus politics that actually works, that seems like a long forgotten thing. The idea of reaching across the aisle. I'd love to see that happen more and more often. Your genuine political friendships. I think we've lost some of that.
Okay, well, I want you now to put your theologian hat on and think about perhaps the anxiety is also fueled by the fact that political power feels increasingly ultimate to us. In some ways, it might have stepped into the God gap.
Totally. I think that's very... I really agree. It's interesting to look at sort of particularly Western, but not just Western constitutions, which do reference God. And that feels in a secular age, it feels a little bit odd. We have the Lord's Prayer in the Australian Parliament at the beginning of it. And we do mention a very non-sectarian God, I think is mentioned in our constitution quite vaguely. But still, you get the sense that there is something more than the state, that the state itself and those who operate in government actually are subject to something else. I think the attempt for the Declaration of Human Rights, the UN declarations from the 1940s, that sort of tries rather nobly to step into the gap, to be something that you can say, hey, Australia, the Australian government, you're not meeting this Declaration of Human Rights. You're not recognising the humanity of others, and you ought to measure up to that. But it's always a very human process, isn't it? So I do think that states, governments are now, even though they call themselves liberal, are actually seeing themselves as not simply these sort of arbiters of different conceptions of what's good and different ideas of human freedom and different aspirations for human life, but actually they are to declare what is good in human life. And that's an interesting moment. I wonder if governments will be able to restrain themselves, even, as I say, even liberal governments, from taking that God place.
Now, when Christians get involved in politics, this can make people nervous, including plenty of Christians. Is there good reason for that unease?
Well, there are some good reasons for that unease, because I think, interestingly, at the moment, I think there's a sort of anxiety amongst some Christians that, particularly in the West, Christianity is losing its influence in terms of the common discourse. I think that's actually evident and true. That's not just true in terms of the numbers that you might get in a census, but various governments are kind of moving away from traditional Christian ethics and thoughts while retaining some. And so there's a little bit of anxiety about that. And so you do see people saying, look, we've got to reassert ourselves in terms of government. We've got to re-Christianize the state. There's a sense of loss there and a concern, I think, not unjustified concern. I'll put it that way, not unjustified concern that without a kind of Christian consensus, at least vaguely a Christian ethical consensus, what's going to fill the gap? What could that be? Is it just pragmatism? Is it just money? Is it just whatever you can get away with? That's a reasonable concern. However, I think actually, if we look a little bit more closely, there are Christians still involved in all levels of government who are inspired by a kind of constructive view of the common good to work for the good of all. I think that's actually the right Christian position. And you'll see that, for instance, there are probably more Christians in politics than percent of the population. That's a guess, but Greg Sheridan, the Australian journalist, said to me he thought that there were fewer journalists who were Christians than percent of the population and more politicians, which probably leads to some of that dissonance that you see. You've got religion in politics being badly reported. I thought this was true of the Morrison years. I'm not an advocate for Scott Morrison. I thought he was open to criticism. However, the way his Pentecostalism continues to be reported is astonishingly ignorant. I'm just staggered that professional journalists are so ill-informed and do so little to inform themselves about what someone's religious beliefs might be and how they impact their day-to-day life and their political vision. I thought this was a really alarming moment, or a telling moment in Australian public life, for sure.
I think we would very, very much agree with you that there is a lot of religious illiteracy out there, but it's probably also the case that politics is often seen as a nasty, compromising business. And if, as you say, perhaps there are more Christians than not in politics, then we have the spectacle of Christians behaving badly, maybe, or compromising themselves. Like, surely that is part of the unease.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're a critic of the Morrison government and Morrison is openly a Christian, or if he's being accused of deceit, which he denies, of course, then that's kind of alarming. And I think that's important. We need to not give people, Christians especially, need to not give people a leave pass from integrity. And also, I think it's important to vote for a person who is a skilled politician and someone who is capable of governing and a person of good character, whatever their religious beliefs. I'd rather vote for that than vote for the person who bats for my team, as it were. Having said that, there are actually numbers of openly Christian politicians who I think are exemplary and do very well. I think Mike Baird would be one of those. Christina Keneally would be another. So interestingly, both sides of politics, both have theology degrees and both were premiers of New South Wales, and I admire them both. Both of them had complex issues to deal with. I think the other thing is to remember that politics is messy. It's not a business of idealism. It does take compromise. It does take building coalitions of people who don't always agree on everything. And so we may from the outside think that, oh, there's dirty hands involved here, but it's complicated. It's very messy. So I know I've been a critic of, say, the Liberal Party's refugee policies over the years, but designing a refugee policy, a policy that looks after refugees and asylum seekers in a just way that minimises the risk of people drowning in the waters to our north. In a world where there are millions and millions and millions of refugees and you clearly can't let everybody in, and where other countries aren't lifting their weight. That's a complicated thing. So I think we need to have a kind of realism about earthly politics. And I think today we too often, across the spectrum, people of all faiths and none, I think we have an expectation of kind of idealism. When you get involved with governing human beings, you get your hands dirty. You have to make judgments, and you have to realize that your judgments are going to be imperfect and inexact. And you think of yourself as a person who's trying to act with integrity. Of course, there are those that don't, but in trying to act with integrity and take responsibility, you find yourself in agonizing situations. That tells us something about the world, by the way, that the only way to be morally pure is not to live in it. I think that's right. To be a monk and live in the desert. That's not our world, and that's not our calling.
So tell me about Politics 1 and Politics 2, because you make this distinction, and this is quite important for your argument.
Yeah. So in my book, I argue that there's two forms of politics, and actually this idea that there are sort of two forms of politics goes all the way back to the Apostle Paul and to Jesus before him. And that is that there's earthly politics, politics 1.0, and then there's the politics of the kingdom of God, the politics of Jesus Christ. And what's important is not to confuse the two. They both have their role, but ultimately, for Christians, the priority is pursuing and enacting and acting out of this idea of politics 2.0. Let me just explain a little bit more. Politics 2.0 is where we start with Jesus being Lord, and we work out of that. We honor the lordship of Christ and we obey him. We live in a community that lives around his teaching and tries to express his love. So that involves enemy love. Love of neighbor expressed through even love of enemies, making peace as far as we possibly can, and things along those sorts of lines. But Jesus himself makes space for politics of the here and now, the politics that manages fractious, broken human communities and restricts evil as much as it possibly can. And so that's what I call politics 1.0. And it's the politics of the real rather than the ideal, I would say. So it's the politics of trying to do our best in a messy and fallen world with too much information and not enough all at once, making judgments where we can, as best we can, to enable flourishing human life here and now as best we can. So I think that's important, that I think Christians ought to get involved in politics 1.0, but not as a way of advancing politics 2.0, which is the politics of the kingdom of God, which is really about other people coming to know Christ or acknowledge Christ as Lord.
Okay, so there's a distinction between politics 1.0 and politics 2.0, but it's probably the case that people in the secular mainstream would look at Christianity's political profile in Australia and elsewhere and kind of say, you are all about politics 1.0. Have Christians not received the memo?
Some of us haven't, but some of us have. I think the accusation is sticks in some regards. I think looking at America, people feel more alarmed, especially because we kind of inhabit a world much more like the fringes, the coasts of America, more than the heartland. Getting into the heads of people who live in the centre of America is very difficult for us in secular Australia. I think I find it very difficult myself. I don't understand what's going on in the connection between God and politics there very well. I do want to say to Christians, we're not to abandon politics 1.0, the political space, because we're to be good citizens, and we've got a lot to contribute, actually, and I think we do contribute an enormous amount through voluntary work, through building communities, through involvement in political institutions, parties on both sides, all sides of politics, in fact. You can find Christians in pretty much every party. I think people are making a great contribution to the common good. But Christians need to see what that's for. It's not for advancing. We don't advance Christianity through the apparatus of the state. What we do is we seek justice and truth, and we seek the common good. And that helps us to not be so anxious about it, I think. I think Christians of all people ought not to be anxious about what's happening in earthly politics, and so therefore free to act constructively, to make alliances with people who think the same thing.
So how do we make sense of the fact that Christianity is often identified with one side of politics? I mean, you make the argument very strongly that it shouldn't feel at home in any political party, but that is its reputation.
Well, it is, again, it's a kind of American thing more than here. I think the identification of a Christian right in Australia is sort of a post-2010 thing. I mean, we've always had Christian There's always been Christian parties, like the Democratic Labour Party in the 50s was a Catholic party, but very fringe. And again, Fred Niles' party in New South Wales was a kind of morals campaigning party, but again, very, very small and very fringe. Mostly, as I say, Christians in Australia, we've got to remember this, Christians have been on both sides of the political sphere. And Christians should remember the whole suite of issues that they ought to be concerned with, including the state of our environment, including and especially the poor. I think this is a bit of a litmus test for whether a political position is Christian or not, and that is what is its attitude to the poor. It seems to me, if your political position has no regard or nothing to say about or open disregard and contempt for those who have the least, then I don't think it gets to be called Christian. Make of that what you will. I think there are different ways to proceed on that basis. For instance, there's a strong argument to be made that just simply giving welfare away while well motivated doesn't work. It actually perpetuates problems and doesn't educate people, doesn't get them on their own 2 feet, doesn't help them to take responsibility, but takes away responsibility. There's a kind of paternalism about that view. However, a heartless kind of ruthless capitalism, which kind of emerges in the 1980s, I would say, over on the right of politics, again, that sort of takes us away from that vision. So that concern, I think, should make it not an easy bedfellow on either side.
Yeah.
What's the best? This is in terms of the ballot box. We should be assessing what's the best way forward. And also, I think these are matters of, in one sense, political philosophy on which Christians may disagree. And I think this is important for both Christians and non-Christians to realise, is that the means to the ends, well, we can actually disagree on whether, a more trickle-down effect is better or whether a more welfare, a more socialist economy is better. Be informed by data. I think Christians are free to do that. There isn't a kind of Christian political philosophy at that fine-grained level, and that's okay.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're tuning into Justine's interview with Michael Jensen. His book is Subjects and Citizens, The Politics of the Gospel. At this point, Justine, you brought up a word with Michael that is very on the nose today, sin.
Yeah.
But it is one that is frank about the self-serving nature of,
everyone, really?
Everyone. And that really can have huge implications for all of us when combined with power, especially political power. But Michael argues that sin is an especially helpful idea when it comes to our political lives.
I mean, I think I'm always slightly embarrassed about the word sin because
it's an awful word, isn't it? Yeah.
Such a bad press. And yet, at one level, it's an extremely useful word because it helps us to be self-suspicious, to interrogate our own motives and realise how our motivations are often very mixed. And I know mine are. And it also helps us to be rightly critical without being cynical. I think this is a really important thing for Western democracy, actually, is a recognition that we don't want to concentrate power in the hands of too few because we know that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, that's an expression of the Christian doctrine of sin, that actually we need accountability, we need structures, because without those, even the best of us run off the rails. Also, the person we think is a saint is sometimes the most dangerous person of all because we're not looking at them. We're not actually giving them proper scrutiny. So I think recapturing some sense of that universal condition we live in. I mean, of course, it's a theological word, and my view is it invites us to think, what is good? Where does good come from? And I think that's an important part of our political discussion that we don't often address is, why is this good? Is there an account of the good that we're assuming? And I think we'll find that on the left and the right, there's actually more than echoes of the Christian idea of what is good, the idea of the image of God and the equal dignity of all human beings. It's a thoroughly Christian idea. The idea that we have responsibility for our neighbour is written into our nation's laws, in fact, at a very deep level. And it's very hard to escape those. This is kind of Tom Holland's thesis in his book Dominion, that actually the progressive left and the conservative right actually are the children, sometimes the stepchildren, of a Christian sensibility. You wouldn't have that compassion for those who are victims. You wouldn't have an analysis of social sin, of the structures of social sin, without a Christian worldview. I mean, Marxism itself has a doctrine of sin, which involves money, of course.
But hang on, it's only the people in power, is that right? That are the sinful people?
Yeah, now it's limited, and that is because I think a view of, and I find this actually as a criticism perhaps more of the progressive side of politics, is that it too readily collapses sin into structures and then makes everybody a victim of the structure, and then you get innocence through being a victim. Whereas I think a better psychology and theology of the human person says that we're both victims and perpetrators all at once, and that we do have agency. We're not just simply sort of the victims of the system. We're not just the products of our social environment. We're more than that. We are certainly influenced by those things, but we're more than that too. There's a kind of fatalism over in that way of thinking, actually. A kind of, I can't escape the system, or the system is so powerful I can't ever gainsay it.
It's almost like, oh, my genes made me do it. It has a sort of Darwinist sort of, I'm only just living out my evolutionary
I have to,
heritage.
yes, I can't help my privilege, and so that's how I'll be. And I don't think I think Christianity actually, even though it says we're all we're all enmeshed in sin in this way, actually also calls us to a deeper responsibility and gives us the power to do it while not asking us to save the world, which is a beautiful thing. To not have to be the saviour of the world because someone else has done that.
Let me ask you about politics too. You kind of characterize this as the sacrificial community, a community where the politics of hospitality is being practiced, where reconciliation between warring parties can maybe have some kind of, they can make peace with each other. If Christians are finding themselves actually practicing that politics 2.0, what is the benefit for everyone else?
The Christian community at its best is not living out in the desert in sort of a closeted, walled community. It's got semi-permeable boundaries. My church always has people in it who aren't Christians or at various stages of their faith journey, if you like to use that language, who find themselves members of the community. It's got all sorts of conditions of human beings, you might say. And that's the hospitality thing, actually, an invitation to be part of a community that's humbly seeking transformation in that way and practicing at a face-to-face level, peacemaking and reconciliation and love of neighbour. You know, that's what I find actually in the era of the internet is we sit here and we click and we get outraged about stuff happening a long way away. That's important. You know, it's important to know about Ukraine and Gaza and to care. But I find that often it's actually the local level where things become very difficult, where we have to have hard conversations, or we have to learn about living together with people that we don't like. That's actually where what you think about right and wrong, what you think about the right human life actually makes a difference. I think we live in this very disconnected community, increasingly isolated and lonely, with our institutions declining, not just churches. And that's to our great impoverishment, actually. Churches are sort of schools for character, producing citizens that punch above their weight in terms of caring for others, seeking justice, volunteering, helping, and educating the young. The Christian church has a good track record on some of those things.
Yeah, when you were saying, you mentioned face-to-face living among people who you may not necessarily have common cause with to begin with, I was like, yes, that does feel like a very political act, especially in an age of a lot of online kind of communication. My sense is that young people as a whole, obviously it's very dangerous to make sweeping statements, but my sense is that young people feel quite politically disengaged, and maybe that's because of the climate crisis, maybe that's because they feel like they're not going to be able to buy a house, and that's not just in Australia, that's elsewhere as well. Do you have a particular call for them, especially, as to why being apolitical is not the option?
Yeah, I think I agree with your analysis, and I think you're right. There's a sort of sense of helplessness. I'm alarmed, again, anecdotally, I'm alarmed at the way in which some extreme voices in the environmental movement have spoken in such a way that I think young people are just full of doom. It's sort of like they're just inevitably waiting. And so they feel helpless. There's nothing that, what's the point is what I've heard people say. What's the point of really getting engaged because we can't do anything and governments won't do anything? And I do understand that, because there's a sort of overwhelming sense that the world just moves on and we can't really do anything about that. But I think the wonderful thing about the Christian message actually is that, again, as I said before, you don't have to be the savior of the world. Actually, God is sovereign and God cares and God is powerful, and I don't know what he will do. I don't know why he's doing what he's doing, but I find my call to follow him. It's just a little thing that this little human being can do. I don't have to be the savior of the world or die for it. I just have to follow him. I have to do what he would like done with the limited power that I have. It's wonderfully liberating. I think one of the great truths of the Bible is that God is God and you're not. And it's a terrible burden to have to be God, turns out. So, on the other hand, that kind of reduces us from our own God complexes. But it's wonderfully liberating because it turns out, and I think maybe as we get older, we realize it more and more. We realize how our potency is limited, our time is limited, our intelligence is limited. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything. We can do what is before us.
I imagine someone listening in might say, look, that's all very well and good for you. You have a savior that you can count on. But, what if that person just isn't convinced? What are they supposed to do if they don't have someone who's upstairs, who's in charge ultimately?
Well, I mean, I'd like to ask them, what do you think is the horizon of the good, the kind of bigger transcendent good? Because without that, I actually do think that a nihilist sort of has a point, right? I do think that we sort of make assumptions that, well, there are just good things that are self-evident. And so I just want to ask about that. I agree there are other ways of having transcendent goods in the world, other plausible ones. I'm not saying that the Christian God is the only one available or the only plausible one available. And there are secular versions of that, but I think that'd be my appeal, is that what is it that's good and beautiful and true? What determines that? What makes that? And why do you feel drawn to it? Why, when you look at the world, is there a disjunction or tension between what you think should be and what actually is? And where does that come from? So I'd love us to talk more about that actually in our culture, rather than talk about the issues all the time, to talk about, well, this is the ideal. This is what the human life on this planet should look like. People might talk about, love. But again, where does love come from? What is love? How do we define it? Because there are many different versions of that. Some people say all religions are about love. Well, actually, I don't think that's the case. But that kind of reflection, I think, is really, really healthy, and may actually lead to a better sense of what one should do in the world as we find it.
Justine here, just jumping in. I don't know if you noticed it, but Michael mentioned nihilism, and I wanted him to go back to that, slow down a bit and unpack it a little bit for us. What happens if you wander down the nihilist path?
If you don't have some view of the good, some kind of plausible transcendental, if you like, then actually nihilism is what makes sense. I think if you say, look, there's nothing out there, well then I can't see why you wouldn't just do what you want to do. What you can get away with, because there is no transcendent ground for anything, really. Nothing means anything, or you can make anything mean what you want it to mean. And I think that's, to some degree, the kind of moral confusion we find ourselves in. If we don't have some kind of transcendent ground, some bigger thing, then other things fill it, or you've got nothing. And it might be money, it might be pleasure, or it might be nationalism. I mean, you can see why nationalism is kind of tempting if you haven't got something beyond that. And that's where you actually get quite a poisonous sort of nationalism. So I think it's very dangerous to say there's nothing, because when you say there's nothing, people find us something.
Okay, last question. Imagine it's the future and wherever we happen to be in the world, the other team won in the last election and things don't feel great for us, whoever us is. What do you want your fellow Christians to know and do? And how are they to get political?
I think we need to accept what happens. We need to accept this is part of the privilege of democracy, is actually that you get swings and roundabouts when it comes to those who are being elected, those who are put in power over us. And I think we ought to act constructively where possible, wherever we can. I think just resignation and sort of fatalism about the possibilities here is not what you want to do. The Bible actually probably speaks more to Christians living under hostile governments, I mean openly and violently hostile governments, than it does to those living under sympathetic governments. So open the pages of the New Testament and see what it is to be a small and overlooked group with no access to power. And I think you'll see living more and more like Christ and witnessing to him is the way forward. And that's partly why I wrote the book. I want the church to be more authentically the church, because I think that actually has more political impact in the long term. We Christians, by the way, we don't think in 4-year terms. We've got centuries to consider. So that does help, actually, that we're not constricted by the here and now. But because we worship a Lord who's risen, we believe in eternity, we can see things in the very, very long term and not be desperate and alarmed by what might happen in 2025.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Thanks to Michael Jensen. Always interesting to talk to. His book is Subjects and Citizens, The Politics of the Gospel.
Yes, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to a friend. You can also rate Life and Faith or leave us a review, which helps other people to find us. If you want to drop us a line, you can write to us at podcast@publicchristianity.org. As always, a big thanks to our producer, the completely apolitical Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
Writers like John Steinbeck seized the nettle and, in a way, reminded us what the novel could do. Similarly, when the rise of fascism, Orwell and Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn, that writing did change people's perspective and shifted the mental furniture and the political furniture.